iOS 28. Yeah, I think we're okay to start. Yeah.
There we go. Cool. Close. Okay. Cool. And good to go. Cool. All right. Yeah, I guess I'll get started. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Scott Moore. I work for a project called Gitcoin. And in short, we help sustain open source software through a variety of products. One of them is Bounties, which lets you take any GitHub issue and bounty it in any ERC20 token. The other is Grants, which is a major part of sustaining open source maintenance through recurring funding for maintainers. So what is open source exactly? In short, there's sort of three things, like the release of the software. The source code needs to actually be like open and in public. It needs to be royalty free, and there can't be any modifications to the software that are in contravention of the original license. So for example, GPL is one where you're not supposed to use the software for any commercial purpose. And open source software is pretty popular today. About 96% of applications use open source software, and about 57% of code on average is from open source. So it's a pretty big part of our ecosystem. It's also worth a lot of money. So it's worth about $387 billion. And it's a surprise then that most maintainers aren't really that active. In fact, there aren't very many maintainers at all. So in total, these are three figures of the average number of maintainers within most open source software projects. You'll notice the average there is 1 to 2. So like, if there's so much money to be made in open source software, it's kind of surprising that there aren't more maintainers doing this work. And one of the reasons for this, it turns out, is that no one's actually giving them money. So none of this money from open source software is actually going to the maintainers. And so none of them are actually finding time or energy to put towards it on a full-time basis. Very few of them are, I should say. And so you'll notice most of them are non-funded. 62% of respondents of this poll by Ben essentially mentioned that they're not getting any funding. Others are being funded by their employers to do this part-time. And then there's a long sort of tail of other smaller funding options that are just not seeing really a lot of usage today. And so the dilemma for this is especially prominent now because there's not a lot of money, and also there's a lot more work. So you'll notice that on the left here, this is showing the number of dependencies per package in green, which is rising exponentially, and the number of packages per dependency in blue. And there's a lot of work that goes into maintaining these dependencies and ensuring that everything is correct within your code base. And despite this massive growth in the amount of work that it's taking to maintain an open source repo, no one's really getting paid for it. And so this is happening at the same time that like the number of users for open source software is growing exponentially. So these aren't apples to apples, but like in 1998, Netscape had 180,000 users. And in 2018, last year, there were 11 million users for Lodash, a popular NPM package. And so like that's a massive improvement or increase in like the number of users, but none of that really goes to the maintainers. And so it's no wonder then that like a lot of maintainers burn out. This is Jack. He was a maintainer of Semantic UI. It's an interface. It was a project very similar to React or to Vue. It was a front-end interface, way to build front ends. And it was effectively shut down after about 3 years of work because Jack didn't have any time to really spend on it. Similarly, there was the case of OpenSSL, which I think is probably more prominent. Back in 2014, there was a bug called Heartbleed. How many people are familiar with Heartbleed? Yeah, so Heartbleed was effectively a massive bug, caused billions of dollars of damage. And the reason it happened was because there were 1 or 2 maintainers that effectively were getting paid nothing to work on this critical piece of software that they just cared passionately about. Full-time, they had full-time jobs. They couldn't actually spend like all their time on this. And so they tried their best to catch all the bugs, but they just couldn't within the time frame that was available to them. And so, the quote here at the bottom, it might be a bit hard to see on this slide, is like, the mystery isn't that a few overworked volunteers missed this bug in the first place. The mystery is that it hasn't happened more often. One more example, more recent. How many of you are familiar with Event Stream, the recent issues there? In short, Event Stream was a NPM package that was managed by one sort of key maintainer who has done a lot of work in a few communities, including Secure Scuttlebutt, which is quite close to the Ethereum community. There's a lot of overlap between some of the projects there. And this was a really salient point to me because he mentions here, like one time I was working as a dishwasher in a restaurant. I made the mistake of being too competent, got really promoted to cook. It was only like a 50 cents an hour pay rise, but massively more responsibility. Didn't really feel worth it. And so writing a popular module, he says, is like this times a million, and the pay rise is 0. And that's sort of what it feels like to be a maintainer in open source software today. So how do we actually solve this problem? In short, we're sort of seeing 2 major trends or 3 major trends in sort of this magic internet money world that at least provides some way to try and rectify this. The first is that with programmable money, we can actually program our values into money. If we value open source, we can actually try to support open source. There's an alignment of incentives within the Ethereum community as well around how we actually think about open source software. And so because of that, a lot more projects in this space, relative to the average in general in most tech, are willing to support open source. And again, it's easy to transfer value globally within this sort of ecosystem. And so we've been able to bootstrap a network of coders who are willing to work on these kinds of open source problems very quickly, globally, in a way that wasn't really feasible beforehand. And so, everyone needs devs, everyone needs open source, everyone needs things built, especially more these days remote. So we created a marketplace that essentially lets you do that. I think most people here are probably already familiar with this marketplace, so I won't belabor this point too much. But in short, as I mentioned at the beginning, we take GitHub issues and we let you basically bounty those issues out. We don't have a coin. It's in any token, any currency really, including eventually fiat currency. We don't want this to be particular to any coin or particular to any funding mechanism. You should be able to choose how you want to fund open source software. And this is solving this user to contributor problem. So there's sort of 3 stages here. There's this growth, and this is something that's been talked about by a lot of people in the open source community for a while. So what you often have is users who are very, very active. You usually have a lot of them in a lot of these open source projects. You have many contributors, but not nearly as many users as you have users. And then you have a few maintainers, like the 1 or 2 I talked about before. And so what we're trying to do with this first bounties product, and what we've sort of done to date, is get more of these users to actually onboard to these repos and become contributors, because that conversion rate currently is extremely low. So we're trying to figure out how can we get more of these people to actually engage with these projects and become long-term, sustainable contributors of these projects. And so this is sort of the way that works. In short, we're getting money currently from the EF, the Foundation, the Ethereum Foundation, the Ethereum Community Fund, and Consensus. And so big thanks to all 3 of those organizations for supporting us in this. And then we're effectively giving that money in addition to money that's being given out by other projects in the ecosystem to their own projects or to other projects that they want to support to these core open source infrastructure projects. So in the context of Ethereum, a lot of those are things like layer 2 solutions or beacon chain implementations, core pieces of software, even libp2p, core pieces of software that people need to actually function in this ecosystem. And one of the reasons this is possible is that, as I mentioned, it's really easy to transact small amounts of value. So typically it would be very hard for people to actually get 60 to do something for $60 online. And the point of this isn't necessarily even that they're getting $60. The point of this is that it surfaced the issue to them so that they can actually pay attention and collect that $60 just as an ancillary benefit. And this helps solve that problem of maintainers or contributors not having enough time to contribute to open source software. If you're getting paid for it, and this is often a point we come up against, if you're getting paid for it, you actually just have more time to do it because you don't have to work a full-time job as much, ideally not at all. And so this is a first step towards that. And so today we've got some pretty good stats. This is our mesh network. Usually it would be animated, but I have this in PDF, so it's not going to work here. We have about 300 or so funders, 17,000 or so developers that have sort of tested out the site, and about 3,000 transactions to, I think that number of coders is actually quite a bit higher now, but those are people that have actually full-time completed bounties using MetaMask. And this was launched in November 2017. most of this growth was in the last sort of 6 to 7 months. So it's been great to see people actually actively using this in the community. And so, I talked about user to contributor, but the question is, and one of the problems with Bounty is, which we talk about a lot, and which we get questions about a lot, is how do you actually get these people to become maintainers? And how do you make sure people aren't just doing one-off tasks and never coming back to a repo and never doing anything else with this project that they care so much about? And the solution to this is effectively what we're calling Gitcoin Grants. And Gitcoin Grants was launched about 2 months ago. It's effectively Patreon for open source, and it provides a recurring stream of revenue to open source maintainers in a way that's sort of like Patreon. And it uses EIP 1337 to do that. And yeah, I mean, what we've done so far is effectively use this paper by Vitalik, Glenn, and Zoe to implement something called capital-constrained liberal radicalism. In short, what that means is we're matching the contributions that people make to these Gitcoin grants based on the square of the sum of the square roots of contributions. And so all that means is suppose you have 2 contributors donating $4 each. You're taking the square root of 4 plus the square root of 4, squared 16. And if you have that same amount, and I think I actually have a slide for this here. This is the paper, by the way, just outlining sort of the rules. I would recommend reading it. It's a bit more abstract, but I think it's a good grounding for this sort of subject if you're interested. And so this is the slide I was talking about. In short, if you have some fixed amount of funding, it will actually, the match will increase based on the total number of contributors. And so the point of this is essentially just that you're trying to create some way for people to feel like their contributions individually matter, and for those contributions to signal some additional interest from the community in funding a particular project. And so that's sort of what we've done here as a starting point with round 1, which we actually just finished a couple weeks ago. So Prismatic Labs was able to get about 6.5K in matching funding. Moloch was able to get about 4.4, and then there's a sort of a long stream Uniswap as well of other projects that have been able to effectively, double or even in some cases quintuple their contributions based on this matching model. And so with this in mind, we've decided to sort of increase the stakes of this, and we've essentially decided to do round 2, which is sort of what I'm here to announce today. So round 2 is funded in part by, again, the Ethereum Foundation, Consensus, and some other sponsors in the community. And it's also funded by the community itself. And this is probably the most important slide, and I'd like to thank Eric Connor from ETHub for this sort of initiative. So he created, on his own accord, this Gitcoin Torch initiative. And we found out about it a few days afterwards, and we're extremely thrilled that he was able to actually round up some funds for this and get people engaged in this. And so we've raised, actually, I think this number is out of date now. We have about 15,000 in direct matched contributions from the community. And these will be matched in that CLR fashion, basically directly to the campaigns in round 2. And actually, this QR code is active, so this is going to be my, please donate $1 today moment, where I ask you guys if you're interested to potentially donate to this campaign. And so some of the actually projects in this round include Radical Exchange, which is actually Glenn's major initiative. Their treasurer decided that this was a good way to actually test out the campaigns that are actually the sort of concepts within Radical Markets that they're actively trying to pursue through Radical Exchange. Iron Belly, which is actually a Grin wallet. And the reason we decided to put a Grin wallet on here is because, actually, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this background, but HashMap and a lot of the Grin team have not really gotten a lot of funding from the community at large. And the reason for that is they didn't actually implement any reward for themselves in their project. And so they ended up sort of just being stuck, not really getting a lot of funding. And so we think this is a good bridge between the Ethereum community and other communities. By supporting Grin, we can support sort of this idea that Ethereum is about open source and is able to support it. Actually, Binance will be a large contributor to this particular initiative. Plasma, this is a particular Plasma implementation by Kaoken. Matthew Slipper has done great work on this. Blockchain Education Network, which has been around since I think 2012, and is a large initiative to educate people about not just Ethereum, but blockchain in general. Block Scout, an open source block explorer. and urlib3, which is a very critical part, of the Python ecosystem. So a lot of these things, and what we're trying to get across here, these things aren't necessarily just Ethereum projects. In general, we're trying to support anything that is open source, and this is sort of our first step towards that, outside of just Ethereum. One other thing, so EIP 789 was just introduced by Kevin, our founder, and it's a kind of potentially controversial initiative, but we think it's important to start a discussion around this idea of sustainable open source in Ethereum. And so what the point of this initiative is to allow some kind of 20% fee on issuance rewards to support ecosystem stewardship and to support ecosystem development. And so, this is just one initial proposal for this. The goal of this is not to say that, we have the solution to inflation funding, and in fact, there are already a lot of comments on this, and we have a lot of problems to sort out here. But this is a good first step in thinking about what these sorts of sustainable funding mechanisms might look like, and we encourage everyone to be involved in this discussion. And so with that, I'll give you the last sort of ask for matching. The clock starts now. If you guys want to basically have the sum of the square roots of your contributions matched in this CLR fashion, please take a look here and donate today. So thank you guys so much for your time, and I'll take any questions that you guys have.
The contributions in a legal sense from community members or from companies, are they donations?
Yeah, in this context, they are donations. There is not like a 501c3 or any equivalent. It's just a sort of donation based on your interest in. Exactly.
It's a donation-based
Correct.
crowdfunding.
Yeah. There's no expectation of any kind of reward for this. It's really just if you support or think an open source project is useful, give them a few DAI, basically. Right, this is important, yeah. So you're actually signaling the interest in this project. So this will inform a huge amount of matching.
Love Gitcoin, love everything it does, love the grant system, also used it with Streamer, so it works from our perspective, great. But saying that, is there a problem here with if you have the FOSS model, free and open source, the problem being free? That essentially applications that haven't really sorted out, they haven't utilized token economics properly, and that's why they're failing and have to rely on crowd contributions. Isn't that the essential issue here?
So I think that's a reasonable, in some cases, kind of path of reasoning, but there are a lot of projects that can't necessarily do that, or where it doesn't make sense to do that. So a good example is like Docker is an application layer sort of open source project, and Docker was able to build an enterprise business, and that's fine. Docker has sustained itself very well on that basis, and it was able to receive venture funding on that basis. But a project like OpenSSL can't really do that very effectively, and it's not clear, at least on the face of it, what the token economic model would be for something like OpenSSL. So to me, that's sort of one of the challenges is I think there's a benefit, obviously, to tokenization in some circumstances, but I don't think we want every project out there to just generate a token for the sake of being able to sustain what they're doing. I think there's a lot of cases where that's hurt the ecosystem in the past, where people have just thought this is the only way to actually necessarily build wealth or build a sustainable business. And so, to me, that is a challenge. So I would say, tokenization is not bad. I don't think we should demonize it in any way. But I think there are circumstances where it works and doesn't, and we need to be mindful of those other circumstances. Cool. Thanks so much.